All right, Megan is not here tonight, so if anyone has found a phone in a red and white case, would you please put it on the back wall over there? The other thing is tomorrow at the end, we're going to have a list of names and addresses, and if you could go by the table and check to see if your address is correct, and if it is, initialize that. If it's not, if you'd please scratch it out and write in your correct address and leave that list there. And that's it. We have a hike tomorrow at 6:15 in the morning. We'll leave from here. We're going to go out again to the bluff, moderate to difficult. Yeah, it's because it's at 6:15. But should we do that tomorrow?
We could.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll just walk through Abbo's Alley tomorrow. We'll see. But right now we're going to do the raffle and then give it over.
All right. Aaron McGraw's Better Food for a Better World is Anna Lena Phillips Bell. Give me a number, Steve. 1 to 40. 12. Janine Joseph. 32. Katie Boma. 'All right, Steve Yarbrough's The Realm of Last Chances, Susan Finch. Steve Yarbrough.
Well, as always, I want to thank Wyatt and Barbara, who have made this such an extraordinary conference. And also, my favorite workshop sister, Jill McCorkle. It's a joy, always. And the staff, Adam, Megan, all of them, they're incredibly talented writers and wonderful people, and I'm sure you've all figured that out by now. Yesterday, for some reason that I cannot fathom, I thought about an interview I read. This must have been 25 or 30 years ago with the catcher, Ted Simmons. You all remember him at all? And you know, he was a fiercely competitive ball player. But the interview I remember reading with him just struck me, probably because I come out of an athletic background, and if you can't compete, you're dead. And the line I remember is he was talking about the second string catcher, who I guess was a rookie that year, about the amount of time he was spending with him, and whoever interviewed him said, that's kind of surprising because, you know, the word is that he's going to replace you. And Simmons just said very bluntly, I think it's every ball player's responsibility to train his own replacement. And really, that's kind of what this conference is about. I mean, it really is. We're all fiercely devoted to our work. My colleagues, most definitely, and I hope we all live a long time and write a bunch more books. But you know, when we look out at our workshops, we see the next generation. And I guarantee you that countless times, a piece of advice from Dick or Alice or any of my colleagues here has made a world of difference in somebody's work, in somebody's life, and in the lives of their readers. So it's a special place, and it's always great to be here. My colleagues know that I have been reading off and on from a short story collection that I hope I'll finish one day, because I keep writing novels. I've got 8 stories. This is the 8th one I haven't read here. I wrote 4 in 1998 and 4 in 2010. I guess I'll be through in 2022 at this rate. It's a story called The End of California, and yes, I did write a novel by that name, but it doesn't have anything to do with, I just like the title. And it's the rare first-person story that I'm going to read, and I was trying to think, why do I never do that? And then I remember, when my second book came out, we made the mistake of taking our daughters to the book signing, and I was up there reading a story with the first-person narrator, and my 5-year-old daughter, who had a gravelly little voice like this, about 2 pages in, she says to her sister, "Tasha, Daddy is lying. He has no daughter named Carol." Okay, so Daddy's gonna lie for about 15 pages here. The End of California. The hotel was on Yarbrough, about half a mile from the main shopping district and the street that leads down to the beach. At the registration desk, Annie filled out the guest card, exchanging pleasantries with the clerk, an 18 or 19-year-old girl, while I waited outside in her car. That was the way we always did it. Annie turned and crossed the lobby. She wore a black sweater, black jeans, and a pair of black boots. She liked dark colors, knew how striking they looked against that shimmering blonde hair. "We're in 212, she said, giving my hand a little squeeze as she got in. She started the car and pulled into the parking garage. The room had a fireplace in it and a king-size bed. I put our bags down on a couple of luggage racks in the closet while Annie walked over to the balcony and drew open the curtains. Carmel is laid out on a series of wooded hills that slope steeply toward the ocean. We were high enough so that over the tops of the gnarled cypresses and bungalows down below we could see Carmel Bay. Sunlight lay like a sheen on the water. "Want to walk down to the beach?" Annie asked. We hadn't been alone together for almost 3 weeks. Marcia's parents had been visiting, and we'd taken them first to Yosemite and then to Death Valley. And all I really wanted was to jump in the bed with her. "Too long," she would whisper when we made love after such a long break. "Too long, it's been too long." "Sure," I said. "Just let me change my shoes." A few moments later, we were strolling down Ocean Avenue past cafes and antique shops and real estate offices where you could see pictures of houses for sale. Many of the ads referred to a Carmel charmer, typically a small cottage with an open beam ceiling and a shingled roof that sold for about $800,000. I'd been here once with Marcia back before Kristen was born. We used to joke that if I ever went into private practice and made a killing, we'd buy a little cottage and move here. But almost no one really lives in places like Carmel. People go to those places to have fun, look around at expensive stuff, and spend some money. When their time runs out, they head home. "Did you and Bert ever come here?" I asked Annie. "No. Despite his bank balance, Bert's not really a Carmel kind of guy." "Am I? Well, you must be. You're here." We lingered on a corner waiting for the pedestrian crossing light to turn green. She took my arm, laid her head against my shoulder. "I was here a couple of times with a friend of mine," she said. "Back in '82 and '83, we weren't ever lovers, but I loved him." She tended to release information bit by bit, one chapter at a time. I never heard about this particular friend of hers before, though I'd heard about others. "Why weren't you lovers?" "He was gay," she said. She shook her head. "God, he was so gay, he was almost straight." The light changed, and we crossed the street toward the ocean. Annie walked with a bounce in her step. She was 48, almost 10 years older than I was, yet in her presence I always felt as if I were the younger one. At the foot of Ocean Avenue, there's a mile-long stretch of the whitest sand you'll ever see. That day, even with an autumn breeze blowing cold spray off the water, there was lots of activity on the beach. Couples walking along barefooted, kids playing volleyball, dogs cavorting in the spume. We pulled our shoes off and walked over onto the beach. The sand was surprisingly warm. We got closer to the water, then found a spot and sat down. "You can't beat the ocean, can you?" Annie said. She clasped her knees to her chest and rested her chin on them. "The other day, Marcia told me you guys might go to Hawaii in January." Even before she became better acquainted with Marcia, Annie had frequently brought up her name. Back then, Annie always asked how Marcia was, whether or not I thought what we were doing had made her suspicious. There was a state you could get into, she said, when you knew your wife or husband was having an affair. Unable to face up to it, you actually tried to convince yourself you were crazy. Sometimes people succeeded all too well. She'd been in that position herself, Annie said, and she didn't want to drive Marcia to that point. If I thought she was getting close to it, we could break this off. She wasn't in the business, Annie used to tell me, of ruining people's lives. She never said things like that anymore, but she still brought up Marcia's name. They'd had lunch together once and gone to a movie another time, and whenever some local lawyer gave a party and invited Annie to it, she and Marcia invariably ended up in conversation. Sometimes, from across a crowded living room, I would stand with a drink in my hand and watch them. Annie was the animated one, talking with her hands, touching Marcia on the arm, while Marcia just smiled and said a few words here and there. In those moments, I didn't worry, as any rational man would have, that at any moment one of them might throw her drink in the other one's face. I didn't see them as separate beings, but as a single entity, as two halves rightfully brought together. "Yeah," I said, "I think she's been wanting to go to Hawaii for a while." "You don't sound too enthused." "Well," I said, "Marcia loves the ocean as much as you do, but being at the beach makes her nervous. See that dog over there?" I gestured at a huge German shepherd that was running after a frisbee a teenage girl had just flung into the air. "That dog would worry her to no end. It doesn't have a leash on, and it looks like it could be dangerous. The first time it got within 50 yards of Kristen, she'd want me to go discuss it with the owner. The sun would worry her too. Every 3 seconds, she'd want to reapply sunscreen on Kristen's face. She's convinced that most children currently alive will eventually die of skin cancer." "She's probably right," Annie said. "About the skin cancer, I mean." "She'd be worried that we weren't giving Kristen enough attention," I went on. "She'd want me to get down on my knees and build a sandcastle for her, and I don't know how to build a sandcastle. Nobody ever built one for me." "Nobody ever built one for me either," Annie said. "And I have to tell you something. I really wish they had." So I crawled over to a spot of damp sand and began digging. Every couple of minutes, I'd glance up at her. She sat there watching me, a faint smile on her face, the wind whipping through her hair. Before too long, I'd built something that at least resembled a castle, though I admit it had more in common with a hill of dirt. I wiped my hands on my thighs. "So what do you think of it?" "I appreciate the effort, but it won't pass FHA. Not even if we remodel it? Not even if we retrofit it?" We sat there on the sand, acting silly and having fun, until the ocean began to take a bite out of the sun and it started getting cold. We decided to get up, put our shoes on, and go have dinner. On the way back up the hill, we saw something Annie found curious. A whole row of cars was descending Ocean Avenue. One by one, they would pull into the parking lot, stop for a few seconds at a spot offering a clear view of the beach, then go on through the lot and head back up the street. Many of the cars were luxury models, BMWs, Caddies, Jags. Sometimes they held whole families, sometimes just 1 or 2 people. There were plenty of empty spaces to park and get out if the people in the cars had wanted to. They like the way it looks, Annie said. They just don't want to touch it. One day, about 4 years earlier, I'd been assigned to represent a man named Russell Gates. I worked as a public defender ever since I got out of law school, and I thought I'd seen almost everything. But Russell convinced me I was wrong. He was in his early 30s, a pudgy-looking fellow with thinning hair. When he was 22, he had taken part in an armed robbery of a convenience store out on Kings Canyon Boulevard. He got caught in the parking lot. He served his time, came back home, took a job working for a raisin grower, and was, as he put it, doing real good for close to 3 years. Then one night, Russell ate a carton of ice cream his wife had bought for their 3-year-old son, and they had what he described as a little disagreement. She called him a hog. He hit her a few times. Then, with the pork motif still fresh in her mind, she hurled a butcher knife at him. Russell showed me a picture taken at the hospital by the Fresno County Sheriff's Department. In the photo, he wore a green hospital gown and was sitting on a gurney with his feet dangling off the side. The handle and most of the blade of a butcher knife were protruding from the crown of his head. Now, you might think all they'd have to do would be to pull that sucker out, he said. But the way they explained it to me, there was some other stuff might want to come with it. They made me wait till one of them neurosurgeons showed up, and he put me under some kind of machine that let him look at my brain as he was pulling the blade out. He said he didn't think it had done no damage. As we spoke, Russell hoped we could prove the neurosurgeon wrong, because in the meantime, he and his new girlfriend had had several drinks one night, smoked a little pot, and then gone off to bed. Sometime around 5 a.m., the girlfriend's baby had woken up crying. Russell said his girlfriend was out of it, so he got up and went to the crib and tried to quiet the baby, but she didn't calm down. So he got a pillow and laid the baby on it and began to bounce her, thinking maybe that would soothe her. And one time when she came down, she rolled off the pillow and hit the floor and broke her wrist and one leg. He panicked and grabbed her, and when he did it, he said he must have gotten a bad grip on her because he also dislocated her shoulder. Now, what they claiming, he said, is I did all that damage on purpose, and that even if I didn't, I should have known better than to bounce a baby like that. But the way I figure it, that picture I just showed you is evidence of a couple of things. Number one, it proves I'm a pretty harmless man, because that ex-wife of mine used a knife on me, and I didn't do nothing but cuff her ears once or twice. Number two, who's to say that when they pull that blade out, it didn't take some of my critical faculties with it? Any doctor will tell you it's hard to accidentally break a baby's bones. You actually have to work at it. And the odds were Russell had done precisely that. But strange as this might sound, given the fact that I believe Russell was guilty of severe child abuse, I was struck not by the differences between him and me, but by our similarities. Russell had started out on a short rope, one that couldn't stand too much fraying before it snapped. My rope was longer, but I had the feeling it was coming unraveled. That very morning, while Marcia took her walk, I had been sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and reading the sports page. Suddenly, the front door slammed, and when I heard it, I realized I had no idea where Kristen was. As long as she wasn't crying, I forgot about her. And whenever I did, something bad usually happened. In a few seconds, Marcia was standing before me, holding Kristen's hand so tightly it had turned white. She was 2 blocks away, she said. Jesus, Luke, she's your daughter. When Kristen was 9 months old, I'd gotten absorbed in a ball game, and she had crawled out the front door and eaten a piece of dog shit. When she was about a year old, she'd eaten plant fertilizer on my watch. And when Marcia came home that day from the grocery store and found me on the phone with poison control, she might well have thrown a knife at me if she'd been calm enough to find one. Before Kristen was born, Marcia and I hardly ever quarreled, but we quarreled a lot since then. Our fights, usually brought on by my failure to fulfill this or that fatherly task, had never turned physically violent, but there was violence in the verbiage we hurled at each other, and there was implied violence in the way we avoided each other for days after those fights. Tension hung in the air like chili fog. No amount of sunshine could burn it away. After I had explained to Russell Gates that because of his prior conviction, he would be very lucky if he served only 2.5 years, I walked out, got in my car, and headed straight for a bar. If there had ever been a day I needed a drink, it was that day. The bar I went to, a place called the Daily Planet, was almost empty. Over in the corner at a small table, Annie sat by herself, drinking a glass of wine and reading her horoscope. I knew her only slightly. I'd seen her a few times at parties back when she was still with her husband, a rich PI attorney named Bert Baird. He and Annie had almost driven one another crazy. He'd had a lot of affairs, and according to rumors, she had too. Word was he'd eventually hired a private investigator to follow her wherever she went because he was convinced she was sleeping with half the city. In the end, though, she hadn't left Bert. He'd left her for a 20-year-old student out at Fresno State. She happened to glance up from the horoscope just as I was looking at her. "Hey, Luke," she said, "you look lonesome up there. Want to join me?" She pointed at the empty chair across the table. I'd always been interested in her, and I have to admit it was mostly because of the way she looked. She wore a lot of eyeshadow, and her pants were always just a little too tight, her skirts just a little too short. She was like the juke joint you're afraid to go into when you're 17 or 18. You know folks are having a wild time inside, but for some reason you lack the nerve to open that door. I picked up my drink, a double Bushmills, and carried it over to her table. She said, "When's your birthday?" "September 6th. "A Virgo." She scanned the horoscope. "Your tiredness causes you to see things in a fairly negative light. Thus, you're looking for a new direction. However, any decision you make today should be postponed as long as possible." "I'm not making any decisions today." "You just made one. Come over and sit at my table." "You saying I should have postponed it?" "Not from my point of view." She had already folded up the paper and was looking at me as if I were the only other living person in the world. As I sat there and drank one Bushmills after another, and she had several glasses of wine, I found myself telling her about Russell Gates and how he had hurt the baby. I told her I'd started thinking that if my circumstances were as straightened as his had probably always been, I might have done the kinds of things he had done. I don't know what she said to me or if she even said anything at all. I know that after a while, all that blonde hair dissolved into mist, a gold haze that surrounded her face. And I know that at some point, she took my hand in hers. It was dark outside by then, so I presume other people had filtered in. And it's probable that at least some of them knew one or both of us. Maybe it was the presence of those others that drove us outside. In my next recollection, I'm standing with Annie at the rear of a pizza parlor, holding her and kissing her while rain streams down our faces. "It's 8, she murmured. "You'll worry your wife." I told my first lie of the evening. I don't think she cares anymore. They always care. At least I always did. She pulled away from me. I reached for her, but she put her hand out and gently stiff-armed me. "You may not want to talk to me tomorrow," she said, "but if you do, give me a call." She turned then and walked toward her car, not running, not even hurrying, though the rain was falling in sheets. "Hey, I don't have your number." She stopped long enough to glance back at me. Her hair was soaked, clinging to the sides of her face. She looked as if she had just stepped out of a shower. "If you want it," she said, "you'll find a way to get it." When I woke up the next morning, I didn't want it. I'd gotten home from the Daily Planet the previous night at 8:30, soaking wet, smelling of whiskey and cigarette smoke. Marcia was sitting at the kitchen table, and from the look on her face, I could tell that if I didn't say exactly the right thing, we'd be headed for trouble that could keep us fighting for hours. "Well," I admitted, deciding to tell that portion of the truth which could not be avoided, "I went out and got drunk because I just met a guy who takes the cake." Normally, I didn't tell her about my clients. She had grown up in Montana, and her father epitomized the term Western Republican. Though by his standards she was dangerously liberal, she had always had a tough time sympathizing with drug dealers and child beaters. But the Russell Gates story, which I proceeded to tell her over a plate of warmed-up pasta, somehow struck a nerve. "My God," she said when I finished. "How old was the child?" 8 months. What'll happen to her? Child Protective Services will take her for a while. They'll make her mother go to classes for a few weeks, and then the mother will get the baby back. She'll probably have another boyfriend like Russell in no time at all, and it may not be long before he'll do something similar to what Russell did. In the meantime, Russell himself will be in jail. She's got two of the biggest eyes you'll ever see. Right then, they were staring straight at me. And you really think there's hope for people like that? Sometimes there is. If they're determined to straighten up, and if they have the good luck not to run across the wrong people at the wrong moment, they might quit being what they've been. Kristen was already asleep, so we sat on the couch a while, listening to music and watching the fire flickering while the rain drummed down. Then we went to bed, and though I think it surprised us both, we ended up making love for the first time in 3 or 4 weeks. She wrapped herself around me, flexing and unflexing, somehow managing to inhale and whisper my name at the same time. It was just like it used to be, back when it had been good. At breakfast, she sat across the table from me, wearing the old terry cloth bathrobe I'd given her a long time ago. All the enmity we'd built up the last couple of years seemed to be forgotten. That morning, everything was fine. I didn't know what had gotten into me the previous night in the lot behind the pizza parlor, but I knew I had to keep it from getting into me again. Russell Gates had said I was doing real good for close to 3 years. I did real good for all of that day and most of the next. Then, having persuaded myself that all I intended to do was have a friendly chat with Annie so she wouldn't think I was a heel, I picked up the phone in my office and called information. There was no listing, so I called a friend who I thought might know her number, and he gave it to me, adding with a chuckle that I'd better be careful. Her message machine answered. As soon as I began to speak, she came on the line. "Hey," she said, "was I right about you not wanting to talk to me the morning after?" "Well, maybe," I said, "but the morning after was yesterday." "Who gave you my number?" I told her. "And what else did he give you? Some advice, maybe?" "Not that I remember." "You're lying," she said pleasantly. "And please don't take what I'm going to say the wrong way, Luke, but you don't strike me as the kind of person who can do this." Instead of realizing that she'd just paid me a compliment, I told myself she'd probably just changed her mind. She was most likely seeing any number of guys who could do this, whatever this was. I tried to keep the disappointment out of my voice, but I didn't succeed. "It sounds like you've lost interest." "No, I haven't," she said. "And by the way, my interest in you wasn't born the other day." In 15 minutes, I was at her house, laughing at the sight of a huge brown teddy bear propped up against the head of her bed. If you stood that bear up straight, he would have been 6 feet tall. He had hot pink paws. "His name's Coolidge," she said, "and he's being displaced." She picked the bear up and set him on the floor. All the people I'd met in the consultation rooms at the jail had done something surreptitious. Very often they had done it at night in a dark alley, in a car parked near a deserted lot, or in a sour-smelling room in some seedy apartment block. When I met them, they were where they were because those surreptitious acts had somehow come to light. Though I had told many a teenaged car thief that if he continued stealing cars, he would continue to end up in jail, I didn't really believe it was necessarily so. If you kept your head about you, I thought, you could avoid the law. The problem was that most criminals didn't keep their heads. They were poor technicians. Neither Annie nor I, as it turned out, was a poor technician. We enjoyed ourselves, but we never forgot what we were doing, and we were good at covering our tracks. Over the next 4 years, we traveled together to San Francisco and Sacramento numerous times because I frequently had legitimate reasons for being in those cities. And we spent a few weekends together in Santa Monica and San Clemente. We went to Chicago when the American Bar Association met there, though I never made it to any of the conference proceedings. Waking up beside Annie became a regular part of my life. I learned the kinds of details you only learn about those you live with. She preferred powdered vitamin C over tablets. She drank 3 Diet Dr. Peppers every day. The sight of a U-Haul van depressed her because she had moved so often when she was a child. She was scared of mice and roaches. She liked to talk to children, especially little girls. There were times when she'd stop somebody's daughter on the street to say that her t-shirt was really pretty, or that her bangs looked lovely, and whoever the girl belonged to would have a hard time dragging her away. Checkout clerks loved Annie because she'd engage them in idle chatter and treat them as if they were something more than a hurdle that stood between her and the sidewalk. Whenever we checked out of a hotel, she always left money, sometimes $20 or $30, on the desk for the maids. "It's tough," she said, cleaning up somebody else's mess. It hadn't taken me long to convince myself that I loved her. I saw my love for her not as a thing apart from my love for Marcia, but as something connected to it. Knowing that I was cheating on my wife and risking the loss of her and my daughter served to make me more solicitous of their welfare. "I love you like I used to," Marcia told me on Christmas Eve of my second year with Annie. Kristen had just gone to bed. Marcia and I were sitting there together on the living room couch, looking at the pile of brightly wrapped packages waiting under the tree. Her hand lay on my shoulder. Her fingertips were at play on the nape of my neck. Remember that first Christmas we spent together? I was living then in an apartment not far from UCLA, and my roommate had gone home to Fresno. Marcia came over and stayed in the apartment with me. At her insistence, we went out and bought a tree. Christmas had always been a big thing in her family, but when we got home with the 6-foot firs, she discovered I had no tree stand. I didn't want to waste money on something I was sure I'd never use again. While she took a nap, I filled a mop bucket with dirt and tried to stand the tree in it, but the whole thing tipped over. So I grabbed a hammer and some nails and I hung that damn tree from the ceiling. "You were something back then," she said. Always trying to be some kind of crazy iconoclast. She pointed at this year's tree, which she and Kristen and I had decorated until it glittered and twinkled like the one in Macy's window. "Now look," she said. "See how mainstream you've become?" If for whatever reason someone had taken a photo of Annie and me that Saturday morning in Carmel, the result would certainly have looked mainstream. I woke up as I had so many times before with Annie, pushed up against me, all that blonde hair spread out on the pillow, my arm around her, her fingers and mine intertwined. We could have been any husband and wife taking a weekend away from the kids. We weren't, though, and I knew it. And in that knowledge lay much of the pleasure. While she slept on, I thought about an article I'd recently read in the LA Times. The Times correspondent had discovered a service in Finland that arranged sexual holidays. For a tidy sum, you could go away someplace exotic with someone other than your husband or wife. Judging from the article, nobody in Finland thought this was strange. As I lay there that morning, I felt almost as if I'd gone on one of those holidays, as if I were in Carmel taking a cure. But somewhere in the back of my mind lay the little seed of doubt that was always there when I went off for a weekend with Annie. A faint suspicion that coming back from where I was might involve something more difficult than leaving one place and returning to another. We lounged around the room, drinking wine from the minibar and making love. Annie's zest for sex, the stuff of so many rumors in Fresno, most of which I knew by now were unfounded, was always at its strongest when she and I went away. She trimmed her fingernails down to nothing so that she wouldn't leave marks on me, but still she usually dug into my shoulders pretty good. She kept her eyes open the whole time, looking straight into mine, as if she didn't want to miss a single bit of sensory data. As we lay tangled up in the sheets that morning, she started to tell me about her nephew, who she said wanted to go to law school. She said he'd always looked up to Bert, and since Bert had gone to Bolt Hall at Berkeley, her nephew wanted to as well. But I don't know, she said. I told him I don't think it's as good as it used to be. What do you think? I said it probably wasn't as good as it used to be, but it still wasn't bad. And then without thinking, I said, has he talked to Bert about it? Bert wouldn't talk to him, she said. Why not? He won't talk to anybody in my family anymore. When it ended between him and me, he wrote off everybody connected with me, including my nephew. I said I thought that was a little extreme. If our relationship blew up in our faces, she said, do you seriously think you'd be all I'd lose? Her hair was in her eyes. She brushed it aside, looked at me for a moment during which I had a chance to say something, but didn't. Marcia would never speak to me again, she said, and neither would any of her friends, though they'd certainly have plenty to say about me. She got up and walked naked to the window. She was as unself-conscious about her body as anybody I'd ever known, and with good reason. She was going to be beautiful for a long time to come. She parted the curtains and looked out. It's a nice day, she said. The curtains fell shut and she turned around. Hungry for anything besides me? She said. I thought I detected an edge to her tone that hadn't been there before. We ate omelets in a little cafe on Ocean Avenue and spent the rest of the afternoon prowling through various specialty shops. I was allegedly in San Diego that weekend, interviewing for a position at a private law firm. It would be reasonable enough to return from San Diego with a stuffed whale for Kristen. So I went to a toy shop and found one, a big white thing that I figured was intended to represent Moby Dick. The first time we had ever gone away on a trip to Sacramento, Annie herself had reminded me to get Kristen something appropriate. Now I always remembered. In one shop, a musty antique store where everything seemed inordinately expensive, Annie examined a cedar chest. It had 4 drawers on each side and looked as if it was probably intended to be used as a dresser. The sticker on it said $44.50. That's $4,450. Isn't this beautiful? She asked me. She said she loved touching things that had lasted a long time. We ate dinner at a place called L'Escargot. It's funny, Tony, my French is about like your Spanish. It's funny, given everything that took place before the weekend was over, but some tastes last forever, and I still recall exactly what I ate, chicken with truffles. I have no idea what she ate, but I know that together we polished off 2 bottles of a honeyed white Burgundy. Afterwards, we went for a long walk along the beach. It was chilly that night, a brisk wind blowing in off Carmel Bay. She turned the collar of her jacket up, and once or twice while we walked, hugged herself. She said, I've got a funny feeling. What? I don't know. You're not feeling guilty, are you? I don't think so. Not any more than usual, anyway. Sticky spray was hitting our faces. I wanted to go back to the hotel and start a fire and get in bed. I wanted to hold Annie, to smell the salt in her hair. We turned back. Ahead of us on the right, we could see the lights of Pebble Beach. Maybe it's just the result, she said, of being where we are. Where are we? For the faintest instant, she paused. Before I could adjust my stride, she was moving again. Her hand found mine, squeezed it, and she said, "We're at the end of California." The next morning, I lay in bed watching her blow-dry her hair. She combed it briskly, jerking the tangles out of it. Her face, which I could see in the mirror, looked businesslike. On Sunday mornings, when we'd spent a weekend away, she always woke up early and went through the same routine. When she noticed me watching her, her features softened. She switched the dryer off. "Hey," she said, "I know I woke you, but it's getting pretty late. We need to be going soon. My plane's not supposed to land until 3. "I thought you said 2. "No, it's 3, I said, but I'll get up anyway." Half an hour later, freshly showered and dressed, I zipped up my suitcase and stood it on the floor. Annie sat on the bed watching me. "Aren't you forgetting something?" she said. "What?" For a moment, she sat there looking at me, obviously bothered by something, though she had no intention, it seemed, of telling me what it was. Finally, she got up, walked over to the desk, and picked up her purse. She opened it and pulled out one of those tags they put on your luggage at the airport, the ones that tell the baggage handlers where things are supposed to end up. DFW, LAX, JFK. In this case, the tag, which was pretty ragged looking, said FYI. She attached it to the handle of my suitcase. All this happened many years ago. In the normal course of things, by now I might have gone into divorce law or personal injury. Or after looking at one too many photos of bruised toddlers, I might have joined the other side. You find a lot of former public defenders working in the DA's office. But I do today what I did back then. I sit across the table from the Russell Gateses day after day, and I say what I say, though the difference now is that I know it's the truth. "You think you just slipped up," I tell them, "that the next time it'll all go smoothly. But you keep doing what you've done, and you'll keep getting caught. Every time you get caught, you're going to end up in a place you won't like to be. You won't like yourself for getting to that place either." I tell them there's a price tag attached to every transgression, that having messed up once, they'll never again have a perfectly clean slate. But a slate with one mark on it, I tell them, and here I look them in the eye and draw from the bottomless reservoir of my own conviction, is still a lot cleaner than a state that has 2. Annie had pulled up in front of Fresno Yosemite Airport that Sunday afternoon, stopping, as she always did, way back near the end of the building in the lane where it says driver must remain with vehicle. I leaned over and kissed her. I remember that when I got out of the car, I told her I would miss her. The airport was crowded. The clock on the wall above the SkyWest desk said 2:15. I walked on by the various ticket counters, headed for security. I heard Kristen's voice before I saw her. "Daddy!" She was near the security booth, running toward me now, her arms stretched out. A little 7-year-old girl with pigtails and pink cheeks. Marcia was behind her, smiling, looking a little puzzled maybe, but not upset. I set the suitcase down, scooped Kristen up, and hugged her. I knew exactly what had happened. Annie was right. I had told Marcia the plane would land at 2 rather than 3. And while it bothered me that I'd slipped up, I knew I could talk my way out of it. I was about to give up on you guys, I told them. We were here at 5 after, Marcia said. I don't know how we missed you. I went to the bathroom, and then I went out and looked around outside. I said, I figured maybe I'd missed you in the crowd. We were moving toward the exit, the three of us in unison. To anybody who noticed us, we must have looked like an ordinary family, Dad home from a business trip, everybody happy to see him. Did you bring me a present? Kristen said. Sure, I said. What? We were moving together. That's the fact I can't get past. It was almost as if someone had wound us up at exactly the same instant and set us down so that we were moving in lockstep toward the automatic doors. Those doors would slide open, and then we'd be out there in all that autumn sunshine, the light hitting my face at precisely the same instant the light hit theirs. If we had only kept moving together then, we'd still be moving together now. But when the automatic doors opened, for some reason, or perhaps for no reason at all, I stepped through them a second ahead of Kristen and Marcia. And as I did, two things occurred. I realized I didn't have the stuffed whale I'd bought in Carmel. And Annie materialized as if out of nowhere with that very same whale in her hands. You left this in the car, she said. It's reasonable to think that when she saw my wife and daughter behind me, her face registered shock. It's reasonable to think Marcia's did too. But I can't say for sure if that's what happened or not, because I wasn't being reasonable. I was looking at that whale. It was about 2 feet long, fat and white, with 2 buttons sewn on where its eyes should have been. Thank you all.